My name is Nia Whitaker, and the day my 10-year-old son came home carrying a red velvet box from my parents was the day I learned that some families do not need strangers to destroy them. Sometimes the people smiling in the front pew are the same people sharpening the knife behind your back. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in Atlanta, the kind of afternoon that usually helped me breathe after another exhausting family obligation. I was in my home office, reviewing security reports while soup simmered on the stove, waiting for Trey to return from my parents' estate. He normally came home full of noise. He would kick off his sneakers, shout for me before the door even closed, and tell me every strange thing Grandpa Jerome had said from the pulpit that morning. But that day, the front door opened and nothing followed. No backpack hitting the floor, no laughter, no little voice asking what was for dinner. Just silence. I stepped into the hallway and found my son standing in the foyer with his coat still zipped to his chin. His fingers were wrapped around a small red velvet box, and his eyes looked too old for a child who still slept with a basketball nightlight. "Trey," I said gently. "What happened?" He swallowed hard and held out the box. "Grandma said to give you this right away." I took one step closer, but he did not move toward me. That scared me more than tears would have. My parents rarely sent anything to my house unless it carried a message. In the Whitaker family, gifts were never gifts. They were warnings wrapped in ribbon. "What did Grandma say?" I asked. Trey looked down at the polished floor. "She said not to overreact." My stomach tightened. "And Grandpa?" His mouth trembled. "He said family has to make sacrifices. He said if you call the bank, Dad could get in serious trouble, and it would be your fault." For a moment, the hallway seemed to stretch between us. I wanted to demand every detail, but my son was already shaking. I knelt, pulled him into my arms, and felt his small hands clutch the back of my sweater. "Listen to me," I whispered. "Whatever this is, it is not your fault. You are safe." He nodded against my shoulder, but he did not believe me yet. Children always know when adults are lying to protect them. I sent him upstairs to change, then stood alone in the foyer with the box in my hands. The velvet was expensive, deep red, tied with a gold ribbon my mother probably chose because she believed cruelty looked better when it matched the church colors. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. Before I opened it, my eyes drifted to the framed photograph on the sideboard. Trey, at 7 years old, missing 2 front teeth, holding my grandmother's Bible after her funeral. She had been the only person in my family who ever looked at me without disappointment. Before she died, she created a trust fund for Trey. $250,000, protected, untouchable. A future my parents could not control. At least, that was what I believed. I untied the ribbon. Inside the box was a cheap plastic calculator. For a second, I stared at it without breathing. Then I understood the insult. To my family, I had always been the boring daughter, the quiet one, the girl who understood numbers but not charm, systems but not spotlight. My younger sister Dominique was different. Dominique was sparkle. Dominique was applause. Dominique was the golden child standing beside our parents at the Atlanta Sanctuary of Grace, smiling for cameras while donors praised her luxury lifestyle brand like it was a holy mission. I was the daughter they introduced last, if they introduced me at all. They thought I ran a small tech business because I never corrected them. Their ignorance protected my peace, but the calculator told me they still believed I was too small to be feared. Beneath it was a stack of documents. The moment I saw the trust company's letterhead, my hands went cold. I lifted the first page, then the second, then the third, each one more impossible than the last. Asset liquidation. Wire authorization. Final balance. 0. I read the number again because my mind refused to accept it. Trey's trust fund was gone. Every dollar. Every promise my grandmother had left him. The transfer record showed one destination. Dominique Whitaker Enterprises. My sister's failing dream had swallowed my son's future. I pressed my palm flat against the table to steady myself, but rage was already rising through me, clean and sharp. Clipped to the packet was a yellow sticky note in my mother's perfect cursive. "Nia, do not embarrass this family." Dominique needed bridge capital to protect the church reputation. Family helps family. I almost laughed at the sickness of it. They had sent my frightened child home as a courier for their crime, then called it family. I turned to the final page and found the authorization form. At the bottom was my name, written in blue ink. My signature. Or what someone wanted the bank to believe was my signature. At first glance, it was close. Too close. The angle, the rhythm, the long sweep under the last name. Whoever copied it had studied me carefully. But then I leaned closer and saw the mistake. The first letter curved the way I stopped writing it years ago, after my hand cramped during my first major contract signing. Only one person in my house had access to old documents with that version of my signature. Only one person understood bank forms well enough to make the forgery look professional. I sat back slowly, the kitchen suddenly colder than before. Upstairs, Trey laughed faintly at something on his game, and the sound nearly broke me. They had not just stolen money. They had put fear into my child, used my marriage as a threat, and expected me to bow my head because the Whitaker name was supposed to matter more than the truth. I looked again at the forged signature, and the final piece slipped into place with a terrible calm. This had not been done by my parents alone. Someone inside my own home had opened the door for them. The sound of the front door unlocking snapped me out of my thoughts. I quickly placed the documents back into the folder and slid them into the center drawer of my desk just as footsteps crossed the entryway below. My heart was pounding, but years of dealing with the Whitaker family had taught me how to hide fear behind a calm face. By the time Andre appeared in the doorway of my office, I was sitting in my chair with a neutral expression, pretending to review a spreadsheet. "Hey," he said with an easy smile. "You okay?" I looked at him for a moment before answering. "Why wouldn't I be?" He shrugged and loosened his tie. "Just asking." Then he walked away toward the kitchen. I listened carefully to his footsteps. There was nothing unusual about his behavior. No panic, no hesitation, no sign that he knew I had just discovered someone emptied our son's trust fund. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made me more suspicious. People rarely act nervous when they believe they are still in control. A few minutes later, I joined him downstairs. Andre was standing at the stove, stirring the soup as if he had not a single concern in the world. "Smells good," he said. "Trey home?" "Upstairs." "How was church?" I asked. "Same as always," he smiled. "Dad preached for almost an hour. Half the congregation looked ready to pass out." I forced a small laugh. Normally, that joke would have made me smile. Not today. I watched him move around the kitchen. Confident, relaxed, comfortable. A man completely unaware that every word he spoke was being weighed against a growing suspicion. During dinner, Trey barely touched his food. Andre noticed immediately. "Everything okay, buddy?" Trey glanced at me before answering. "Yeah." The look lasted less than a second, but I caught it. So did Andre. "What?" he asked. Trey shook his head. "Nothing." The rest of the meal felt strangely tense. Every conversation died after a few sentences. Every silence felt louder than it should have. By the time Trey went upstairs for the night, my nerves were stretched tight. Andre poured himself a glass of wine and sat in the living room. "You seem distracted," he said. I settled into the chair across from him. "Do I?" "A little." He studied me carefully. "Something happened today?" There it was. A simple question. Completely normal. Yet it felt like a test. I looked directly into his eyes. Trey came home from my parents' house with a box. The wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth, only for a fraction of a second. Most people would never have noticed. I did. "A box?" he repeated. "What kind of box?" "Red velvet." His expression immediately relaxed. Too quickly. Probably another weird church gift. He took a drink. "You know how your mother is." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know exactly how she is." For the next hour, we talked about ordinary things. Work, bills, Trey's school project, a neighbor's new dog. But underneath every word, I was watching him, looking for cracks, looking for anything that did not fit. Around 10 o'clock, Andre headed upstairs to shower. The moment I heard the bathroom door close, I moved. His home office sat at the end of the hallway. Normally, I respected his privacy. Tonight, privacy had become a luxury neither of us could afford. I stepped inside and looked around. Everything appeared perfectly organized. Financial journals lined the shelves. Client awards sat behind glass. Family photographs covered the desk. The image he worked hardest to maintain was clear. Successful husband, trusted advisor, devoted father. My eyes drifted toward a filing cabinet beside the window. Locked. That alone wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was a stack of papers sitting beside it. The top sheet contained a signature, Andre's signature. I froze. Slowly, I picked up the page and stared at the flowing letters. Then I remembered the forged authorization form downstairs. My pulse quickened. There was something familiar about the way certain letters curved. Something familiar about the pressure pattern. Not identical, but close enough to make my stomach twist. I placed the paper back exactly where I found it. Then I left the office before he could return. 10 minutes later, I was lying awake beside him in bed, staring into the darkness while he slept peacefully. I wanted to believe I was wrong. I wanted to believe there was another explanation. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the forged signature, and every time I saw it, the same question returned. What if the person who helped steal my son's future had been sleeping beside me all along? I barely slept that night. Every time I drifted off, I saw the same image waiting for me: the forged signature, the missing trust fund, the destination account with Dominique's company attached to it. By 3 in the morning, I gave up pretending rest was possible and quietly slipped out of bed. Andre didn't move. He remained asleep on his side of the mattress, breathing steadily, looking exactly like the man I had spent 10 years trusting. That was the problem. People rarely look dangerous while they're betraying you. If they did, nobody would ever let them get close enough to do real damage. I walked downstairs and carried the trust documents back into my office. The city beyond the windows was dark, but my monitors filled the room with a soft blue glow. I spread the papers across my desk and forced myself to slow down. Anger wanted answers immediately. Experience taught me that answers came faster when emotions stayed under control. The first thing I did was create a timeline. The trust fund had been liquidated 12 days earlier. The transfer authorization had been approved less than 24 hours after submission. The money reached Dominique's company the following morning. That meant this wasn't a desperate last-minute decision. It was planned, organized, coordinated. Somebody had prepared everything in advance. I kept reading. A detail near the bottom of one page caught my attention. The liquidation request had been submitted from a secure client portal. Access required account credentials and identity verification. My stomach tightened. Only 3 people should have possessed those credentials: me, the trust manager, and the emergency contact listed on the account. I pulled the original trust agreement from the drawer and turned directly to the contact section. My eyes landed on the name: Nia Whitaker. Of course. 4 years earlier, I had listed my husband as backup contact, because that was what married people did. They trusted each other. At least, I thought they did. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Maybe there was still another explanation. Maybe someone had stolen his credentials. Maybe someone had manipulated the system. Maybe I was trying too hard to make the pieces fit together because I was scared of what happened if they did. Then I remembered something. 2 weeks earlier, Andre had come home unusually irritated. At dinner, he complained about Dominique again. That wasn't unusual. The two of them argued constantly. But one sentence suddenly returned to me with uncomfortable clarity. Dominique is going to destroy herself one day if somebody doesn't help her. At the time, I barely paid attention. My family was always rescuing Dominique from something. Now the memory felt different, more specific, more personal. I opened my calendar and checked the date. It matched the week the trust fund disappeared. My pulse quickened. One memory became another. 3 months earlier, Dominique showed up at Sunday dinner wearing a designer watch that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. My father praised her success. My mother bragged about expansion plans. Then Dominique accidentally left her phone on the dining room table. A message flashed across the screen before she grabbed it. Payment overdue. Final notice. I remembered it because her face had gone pale for a second. She laughed it off and claimed it was a mistake. Nobody questioned her. Nobody ever questioned Dominique. They preferred comforting lies to uncomfortable truths. Suddenly, a pattern began forming. Failed ventures, debt notices, emergency meetings. My parents acting nervous, and now $250,000 stolen from my son. The pieces were moving closer together. Around 7 o'clock, I heard footsteps upstairs. I quickly organized the paperwork before Andre came downstairs. By breakfast, I had decided on one thing. I was not confronting him yet, not until I understood the full picture. If Andre was involved, confronting him too early would only give him time to hide evidence. So I smiled. I acted normal. I asked about his day. I kissed him goodbye before work. And for the first time in our marriage, every word felt like part of an investigation. The opportunity arrived that afternoon. Andre called to say he would be late because of a client meeting. The moment the call ended, I walked straight into his office. This time, I wasn't looking for signatures. I was looking for financial records. Most drawers contained ordinary paperwork, investment reports, client correspondence, tax files. Then I found a folder labeled DW. My heart immediately started racing. Dominique Whitaker. I opened it carefully. Inside were loan summaries, debt restructuring proposals, and repayment schedules. The numbers were worse than I imagined. Credit lines exhausted, multiple missed payments, several lenders threatening legal action. Dominique wasn't experiencing a temporary setback. She was drowning. I flipped through page after page until one document stopped me cold. A repayment projection showed a funding requirement almost identical to the amount missing from Trey's trust fund. Not exact. Close enough. My hands tightened around the paper. For the first time, the theft no longer felt like a theory. It felt like a solution. Dominique needed money. My parents needed to save their favorite daughter. Andre had access to the account. The motive was staring back at me in black ink. Then I noticed something tucked inside the back of the folder. A handwritten note. Just one sentence. No signature. No explanation. But I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately. Do whatever is necessary. We cannot let Dominique fail. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I carefully returned everything exactly as I found it, because now I knew two things. First, Dominique's financial collapse was far worse than anyone publicly admitted. Second, my mother was involved. The only question left was whether Andre had willingly joined the conspiracy or helped create it. For the next 3 days, I became an actress in my own marriage. Every morning, I kissed Andre goodbye. Every evening, I listened to his stories about clients, market trends, and long meetings that supposedly kept him away from home. I laughed when he expected me to laugh. I nodded when he wanted agreement, and the entire time, I watched him. The hardest part was not gathering evidence. The hardest part was accepting how natural deception seemed to him. There were moments when I almost convinced myself I was wrong. Then something would happen, and the doubt would disappear. On Wednesday night, my parents hosted a family dinner at their estate. Normally, I would have found an excuse to avoid it. This time, I accepted immediately. If people were hiding secrets, they were more likely to expose them when they believed they were safe. The moment we arrived, I could feel tension beneath the usual performance. My father greeted everyone with his practiced smile. My mother floated through the dining room like a queen inspecting her court. Dominique sat beside them wearing a white designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She looked exhausted despite her efforts to appear confident. Dark circles hid beneath expensive makeup. Her smile appeared half a second too late every time someone spoke to her. She was under pressure. The question was how much. During dinner, the conversation revolved around Dominique's business expansion. According to my father, she was preparing for the biggest year of her career. According to my mother, investors were lining up to support her vision. According to Dominique, several exciting partnerships would be announced soon. Every statement sounded rehearsed. Every compliment felt staged. Then my father turned toward me. "Nia," he said, "have you considered helping your sister more directly?" The room became quiet. I knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't asking a question. He was testing my reaction. "How would I help?" I asked calmly. "Family should support family," he replied, "especially when one member has the opportunity to make a meaningful difference." There it was again. Family. The favorite weapon of people demanding sacrifices they would never make themselves. Before I could answer, Dominique jumped in. "Dad, leave her alone." She laughed awkwardly. "Nia already has enough to worry about." The statement sounded harmless. But I noticed something strange. Andre immediately looked at Dominique. Dominique immediately looked at Andre. The exchange lasted less than a second. Most people would never have noticed. I did, because guilty people often communicate without speaking. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of forced smiles and empty conversation. As everyone prepared dessert, I stepped outside onto the back patio for air. The evening was cool and quiet. For the first time all night, I felt able to think. Then I heard voices around the corner of the house. Instinctively, I stopped moving. "This can't continue," Dominique whispered. "I know," Andre replied. My pulse immediately accelerated. I moved closer without making a sound. "You promised this would solve everything," Dominique said. "It bought time," Andre answered sharply. Nothing more. Silence followed. Then Dominique spoke again. "If Nia finds out, she won't." His response came too quickly, too confidently. "Andre, relax." Another pause. "Everything is under control." I felt ice spread through my chest. They weren't discussing a theory. They weren't discussing a possibility. They were discussing something that had already happened. Before I could hear more, the patio door opened behind me. My mother stepped outside carrying a tray of drinks. I immediately walked toward her before she could suspect anything. By the time I glanced back, Andre and Dominique had disappeared. The drive home was quiet. Trey slept in the back seat while Andre focused on the road. I studied his reflection in the windshield. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to demand answers, to force him to explain the conversation I had just overheard. But another part of me understood something important. I still didn't know the full truth. I only knew enough to realize the conspiracy was bigger than I originally believed. When we finally arrived home, Andre headed upstairs. I remained downstairs pretending to clean the kitchen. 10 minutes later, I heard his phone vibrate on the counter. He had forgotten it. I stared at the screen. One unread message glowed against the darkness. The sender's name made my stomach drop. Dominique. The preview contained only 5 words. "We need to talk tomorrow." Beneath the message was a paperclip icon indicating an attachment had been sent. Before I could open it, footsteps sounded above me. Andre was coming back downstairs. I quickly placed the phone exactly where it had been and stepped away from the counter. But one thing was already certain. Whatever attachment Dominique had sent, neither of them wanted me to see it. The next morning, I woke up with one thought repeating in my head. The attachment. Whatever Dominique had sent Andre the night before was important enough to make her nervous and important enough to risk sending directly to him. More importantly, it was the first thing I had seen that neither of them expected me to notice. For the first time since discovering the theft, I felt like I was no longer chasing shadows. I was getting close to something real. At breakfast, Andre acted exactly like himself. He read market updates on his tablet, drank black coffee, and complained about traffic before leaving for work. If I hadn't overheard the conversation at my parents' house, I might have believed everything was normal. That was what made the situation so disturbing. The better I understood the truth, the more carefully everyone around me seemed to perform their lies. After he left, I dropped Trey off at school and spent the entire drive replaying the previous evening in my mind. One sentence refused to leave me alone. It bought time. Andre had not said the problem was solved. He said it bought time. That meant whatever happened with the trust fund was never intended to fix Dominique's situation permanently. It was a temporary rescue, a lifeline. Which raised a much bigger question. How bad were her finances really? When I arrived home, I opened my office door and began digging into public records. Dominique loved attention. People like her rarely understood how much information they left exposed. Within an hour, I had assembled a troubling picture. Several of her businesses had changed lenders within the last 18 months. 2 former vendors had filed civil complaints. 1 warehouse lease had been terminated early. None of these problems were catastrophic individually. Together, they painted a different story. Dominique's empire wasn't growing. It was bleeding money. I continued digging. By lunchtime, I found evidence that 3 major product launches had underperformed despite the success she publicly claimed. Investor presentations described expansion, financial filings described survival. It was like looking at 2 completely different companies. One existed for social media, the other existed in reality. Then I found something that made me stop scrolling. 6 months earlier, Dominique had taken out a large private loan using projected future revenue as collateral. The repayment schedule was aggressive, extremely aggressive. If revenue targets were missed, penalties would trigger almost immediately. I stared at the numbers. Suddenly, the panic in her voice during that patio conversation made sense. She wasn't worried about losing money. She was worried about collapse. The trust fund theft wasn't an act of greed. It was an act of desperation. That realization didn't make me sympathetic. If anything, it made me angrier. Because somebody facing financial ruin had looked at a 10-year-old child's future and decided it was the easiest asset to sacrifice. Around 3 o'clock, my phone rang. My mother. I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered. "Hello, Mom." "Nia," she said warmly, the way people speak when they're about to manipulate someone. "How are you?" "Fine." "Good." A pause followed. "I've been thinking about you." That almost made me laugh. My mother never thought about me unless there was an objective attached. That's nice. Dominique has been under tremendous pressure lately. There it was. Straight to business. I'm sure she has. People don't understand how difficult leadership can be. I remained silent. Families should support each other during hard times, she continued. Wouldn't you agree? The words sounded innocent. The timing did not. Depends on what kind of support we're talking about, I replied. Another pause. Longer this time. You're not still upset about that misunderstanding, are you? My grip tightened around the phone. Misunderstanding. $250,000 stolen from my son's trust fund had somehow become a misunderstanding. No, I said carefully. I'm thinking about it very clearly. The conversation ended a few minutes later, but the message was obvious. My mother was worried, not guilty, not remorseful, worried. That meant somebody inside their circle knew the situation was becoming dangerous. Late that afternoon, I received another surprise. An email arrived from a financial consulting firm I had never contacted. Attached was a public notice regarding debt restructuring services. Normally, I would have deleted it immediately. What caught my attention was the recipient list. Dominique's corporate address appeared by mistake among several hidden contacts. I stared at the screen. Then I opened the attachment. My pulse accelerated as I read. The firm specialized in emergency debt negotiations for businesses facing insolvency. Insolvency. The word echoed in my head. Dominique wasn't experiencing a temporary setback. She was standing at the edge of financial disaster. Suddenly, everything fit together. The pressure, the lies, the secrecy, the theft. My parents weren't protecting a successful daughter. They were trying to stop a public collapse. But as I continued reading, one final detail changed everything. Near the bottom of the document was a scheduled meeting date. Tomorrow morning. And listed among the expected attendees was a name I never expected to see. Nia Whitaker. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to convince myself there was still an innocent explanation for what I was seeing. Maybe Andre attended the meeting as a consultant. Maybe Dominique hired him professionally. Maybe my mother's note meant something different than what it appeared to mean. The problem was that every new piece of information made those explanations harder to believe. By evening, my phone rang again. This time it was my father. "Nia," he said without greeting, "your mother and I would like you to come by tomorrow evening." I immediately knew it wasn't a request. "Why?" I asked. "Family discussion." "About what?" A brief silence followed. "Dominique." Of course. Everything eventually led back to Dominique. "I'll think about it," I replied. "No," my father said firmly. "You'll be there." Then he ended the call. I stared at my phone for several seconds before placing it on the counter. Across the room, Andre was watching television. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Dad wants a family meeting tomorrow." For the first time all night, I saw genuine tension flash across his face. It disappeared almost instantly, but not before I noticed it. "Really?" he asked. "What about Dominique?" He nodded slowly and turned back toward the television. "Probably another business problem." The answer sounded rehearsed, like something he had already prepared before the conversation even happened. The following evening, I drove to my parents' estate alone. Andre claimed he had work obligations and would arrive later. Somehow that didn't surprise me. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the atmosphere. Nobody was relaxed. Nobody was smiling naturally. Even the staff seemed uncomfortable. My mother greeted me with an embrace that felt more strategic than affectionate. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You made it sound mandatory." Her smile tightened slightly. Sometimes families need difficult conversations. The dining room had already been prepared. My father sat at the head of the table. Dominique occupied the seat beside him. Several church board members I recognized were present as well. That immediately put me on guard. This wasn't a family discussion. This was an intervention. And I was the target. "Let's begin," my father announced once everyone sat down. He folded his hands together and looked directly at me. "Recent events have created unnecessary tension within the family." Unnecessary tension. Interesting choice of words for the theft of a child's trust fund. I remained silent. "Dominique is facing temporary challenges," he continued. "Challenges that require unity rather than division." "What kind of challenges?" I asked. Dominique immediately looked away. My mother answered instead. "Cash flow issues." That's a very polite way of describing it. The room became quiet. My father leaned forward. "The exact details are not important. They seem important to Dominique." His jaw tightened. For a brief moment, the mask slipped. "What matters," he said, "is that this family presents a united front." There it was: reputation, image, control. The three pillars upon which the Whitaker empire had always been built. Truth rarely made the list. One of the church board members cleared his throat. "Pastor Whitaker has devoted decades to building this ministry. Public controversy could damage many innocent people." I almost laughed. Nobody mentioned Trey. Nobody mentioned the trust fund. Nobody mentioned the missing money. The conversation carefully danced around the actual problem. "What exactly are we discussing?" I asked. My mother exchanged a quick glance with my father. Then she spoke carefully. "We're discussing forgiveness." The word hung in the air. Forgiveness. Not accountability, not responsibility. Forgiveness. "Interesting," I replied. "Usually forgiveness comes after someone apologizes." Dominique finally spoke. "Nia." Her voice sounded tired. "I never wanted things to go this far." Every person at the table suddenly became very interested in her response. That alone told me more than she intended. "How far did you want it to go?" I asked quietly. Her eyes widened. "That's not what I meant." "Then explain what you meant." Before she could answer, my father interrupted. "This isn't productive." No, it was productive. That was exactly why he stopped it. The meeting continued for nearly an hour. Different people spoke. Different excuses appeared. Economic pressure, business difficulties, family obligations, community responsibility. Yet nobody directly addressed the theft. It was like watching a group of actors perform a play while carefully avoiding the central plot. Then the final mistake happened. One of the board members looked directly at me and said, "Surely $250,000 isn't worth destroying your family." The room froze. Absolute silence. My pulse quickened. Nobody had mentioned a number all evening. Not once. Yet somehow he knew the exact amount. I slowly turned toward him. The man's face immediately lost color. He realized his mistake the same second I did. He knew, which meant the people sitting around this table knew far more than they were admitting. Suddenly, the entire purpose of the meeting became clear. They weren't here to solve a problem, they were here to contain one. And for the first time, I realized the conspiracy might extend far beyond my parents, Dominique and Andre. I left my parents' estate more disturbed than angry. Anger was simple. Anger had a target. What I felt now was something far more dangerous: confusion. The meeting was supposed to convince me to back down. Instead, it revealed something none of them intended to reveal. Too many people knew details they should never have known. The church board member's mistake kept replaying in my head during the drive home. $250,000. He had said the exact amount without hesitation. Not an estimate, not a guess. The exact number. Which meant information about Trey's trust fund had been discussed privately among people who had absolutely no reason to know it existed. By the time I pulled into my driveway, one thing had become clear. My parents were not protecting a secret anymore. They were managing one. The lights were still on inside the house. Andre's car sat in the driveway. Apparently, his important work obligation had ended shortly after I arrived at the family meeting. That fact irritated me more than I wanted to admit. I walked inside and found him sitting at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone. He looked up immediately. "How did it go?" The question sounded casual. Too casual. Interesting, I answered. That doesn't sound good. I studied his face carefully. You didn't miss much. Just another Dominique crisis? I nodded slowly. Something like that? For a second, relief appeared in his eyes. Then it vanished. Another tiny reaction. Another detail most people would miss. I was beginning to collect those details. The next few days passed quietly on the surface. Underneath, my suspicions continued growing. The strangest part was not what Andre said. It was what he stopped saying. Before all of this happened, he constantly complained about Dominique. He criticized her spending habits. He mocked her business decisions. He rolled his eyes whenever my parents rescued her from another disaster. Now he never mentioned her at all. Not once. It was as if they had silently agreed her name should be avoided. People often reveal more through avoidance than conversation. Friday afternoon provided another clue. I was working in my office when I heard Andre speaking on the phone downstairs. His voice carried through the hallway. At first, I ignored it. Then I heard Dominique's name. I moved closer without making noise. No, Andre said firmly. You need to stop calling me during the day. Silence followed. Then he listened for several seconds. I understand you're scared. Another pause. That's not the point. My pulse quickened. Because every time you panic, you make things worse. He lowered his voice after that, making the rest impossible to hear. A few moments later, the call ended. I quickly returned to my desk before he noticed anything. My mind raced. Scared. Worse. Panic. None of those words sounded like two people discussing an ordinary business problem. That evening, I found myself thinking back to earlier years. Small memories I once ignored suddenly felt important. Family vacations where Andre and Dominique disappeared for long conversations. Charity events where they seemed unusually coordinated. Private jokes that excluded everyone else. At the time, I dismissed it as convenience. My husband and sister spent time together because our families were close. Now I wasn't so sure. I wasn't thinking about an affair. At least not yet. What bothered me was something different. Trust. There was a level of trust between them that exceeded what either of them showed me. They shared information, protected each other, covered mistakes, operated as a team, and somehow I had never fully noticed it before. Saturday morning brought another uncomfortable moment. We attended one of my father's community outreach events. Hundreds of people filled the church grounds. Volunteers carried supplies. Local reporters moved through the crowd. It was exactly the kind of public setting my parents loved. While speaking with donors, I noticed Dominique standing across the parking lot. She looked exhausted. Every few minutes she checked her phone. Then she looked toward the entrance, waiting for someone. 20 minutes later, Andre arrived. He wasn't supposed to be there. He told me earlier he had a client meeting. The moment he appeared, Dominique visibly relaxed. Not dramatically. Just enough for someone paying attention to notice. My stomach tightened. They exchanged a brief conversation near one of the service tents. Then they walked away from the crowd together. Instinct told me to follow. I waited several seconds before moving. By the time I reached the side parking lot, their voices were barely audible. Dot can't keep doing this, Dominique whispered. You don't have a choice, Andre replied. Neither do you. I froze. What happens if she finds out? Dominique asked. Andre's answer came immediately. She won't. The certainty in his voice frightened me more than the words themselves. He sounded like a man who believed he controlled the outcome. Before I could move closer, several volunteers walked between us. When they passed, Andre and Dominique were already heading back toward the main event. I never heard the rest of the conversation, but I heard enough. For days I had been searching for proof that they were connected. Now I had something even more dangerous. A pattern. A pattern of secrecy. A pattern of shared fear. A pattern of coordinated behavior. Patterns eventually become evidence. I just needed time. Later that evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I reviewed everything I had learned so far. The trust fund, Dominique's debts, the secret meetings, the phone calls, the church board, the family pressure. The missing money sat at the center of it all like the hub of a wheel. Every road eventually led back to the same place. Then I noticed something I had overlooked before. A date. The date of the trust fund liquidation. The date of Dominique's largest debt payment. and the date of a private fundraising gala scheduled by the church. All three events occurred within 48 hours of each other. That wasn't a coincidence. And for the first time, I began wondering whether the trust fund theft had only been the beginning of a much larger plan. The more I learned, the more careful I became. A week earlier, I would have confronted Andre the moment I suspected he was involved. Now I understood that would have been a mistake. People make errors when they feel safe. Once they realize they're being watched, those errors disappear. So I stopped looking like a wife searching for answers and started acting like a woman who had accepted the explanations she was given. The change worked almost immediately. Andre relaxed. My parents stopped calling every other day. Even Dominique seemed less nervous during public events. They believed the pressure campaign had succeeded. They thought I was retreating. In reality, I was finally getting a clearer view of what they were trying to hide. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected place. Early Monday morning, I received a notification from a business publication I occasionally followed. Normally, I would have ignored it, but Dominique's company was mentioned in the headline. According to the article, her brand had secured a new strategic partnership that would supposedly accelerate future growth. At first glance, the announcement looked impressive. Investors praised it, industry blogs repeated it, social media celebrated it. Yet something felt wrong. The numbers didn't match what I had already seen. A company struggling to survive usually doesn't attract major partners overnight. I spent the next several hours reviewing public records related to the deal. The deeper I looked, the stranger everything became. The partner company had almost no operating history. Its corporate structure was unusually complicated. Several addresses connected to the business led to shared office spaces rather than actual headquarters. It wasn't necessarily fraud, but it certainly wasn't the type of partnership Dominique publicly described. By lunchtime, one conclusion seemed obvious. Somebody was working very hard to create the appearance of stability. Whether the business was healthy no longer mattered. The image mattered. And the image was being protected at all costs. Later that afternoon, my mother called again. This time, her tone was unusually cheerful. "Good news," she announced. "Dominique's partnership deal is finally moving forward." I listened quietly. Everyone is relieved. Everyone. Another interesting word. "You sound happy," I replied. "Of course I'm happy." She laughed softly. "Things are finally turning around." Her confidence bothered me. A few days earlier, she sounded worried. Now she sounded certain. The shift was too dramatic. Something had changed behind the scenes. The question was what? That evening, another piece of the puzzle appeared. Trey was finishing homework at the kitchen table when he casually mentioned something that made me stop reading my email. "Grandpa was mad last month," he said. "What about?" I asked. "I don't know," he shrugged. "When I stayed over there, he was yelling at some man in his office. My attention sharpened immediately. "Did you hear what they were talking about?" Trey thought for a moment. "Money, I think. Anything else?" Grandpa kept saying the church couldn't afford another mistake. I remained perfectly calm on the outside. Inside, my thoughts were racing. The church couldn't afford another mistake. That wasn't the language of a confident organization. It was the language of damage control. "Do you remember the man's name?" Trey shook his head. "No, but he wasn't from the church." The conversation ended there, yet it lingered in my mind for the rest of the evening. By now, too many unrelated pieces were pointing in the same direction. Dominique's financial collapse, the missing trust fund, the church's growing anxiety, secret meetings, hidden partnerships. None of them existed in isolation. They were connected somehow. I just couldn't see the full shape yet. 2 days later, I attended a charity luncheon sponsored by one of the church's major donors. I almost declined the invitation. In hindsight, that would have been a mistake. Halfway through the event, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two businessmen were discussing a funding proposal. One of them mentioned Dominique's company. The other laughed. "That thing should have collapsed months ago." My pulse immediately accelerated. "Then why hasn't it?" the first man asked. The answer came without hesitation. "Because certain people keep feeding it money." I stayed perfectly still, pretending to check messages on my phone. "Family?" one man asked. The other smiled. "Let's just say powerful people become very generous when their reputation is attached to the outcome." A few moments later, they changed subjects. But the damage was done. For the first time, someone outside the Whitaker family had unknowingly confirmed what I already suspected. Dominique wasn't surviving because her business was healthy. She was surviving because people kept rescuing her. The problem was that rescue operations eventually run out of resources, and when they do, desperation takes over. That night, I returned home and reviewed everything again: the timeline, the debt, the trust fund, the church pressure, the hidden partnership, the secret conversations. Slowly, a larger picture began forming. My parents weren't simply trying to save Dominique. They were trying to prevent a public collapse that could damage far more than one business. If Dominique failed, other people would fall with her. People with influence, people with money, people who desperately needed the truth to remain hidden. As I sat alone in my office, staring at the growing collection of notes spread across my desk, a realization finally settled over me. I wasn't dealing with a family secret anymore. I was dealing with a network of people who all had something to lose. And somewhere inside that network was the person who first suggested stealing from my son. The first sign appeared so quietly that I almost ignored it. 3 days after the meeting at my parents' estate, I arrived at church for a community outreach breakfast and immediately noticed something felt different. Normally, people greeted me before I reached the front doors. Volunteers waved. Church members stopped to talk. Older women asked about Trey. That morning, smiles seemed delayed. Conversations ended when I approached. Several people nodded politely but avoided eye contact. At first, I assumed I was imagining it. After everything that had happened, paranoia would have been understandable. Then I saw Mrs. Hampton. For nearly 15 years, she had hugged me every Sunday without fail. This time, she offered a quick smile from across the hallway and continued walking. The change was small, but it was real. Throughout the morning, the same thing happened again and again. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just dozens of tiny moments that felt wrong. A conversation that stopped when I joined the group, a volunteer who suddenly remembered somewhere else he needed to be, a donor who seemed uncomfortable speaking to me. Individually, each incident meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. By lunchtime, I stopped questioning whether something was happening and started wondering who was responsible. The answer arrived sooner than expected. I was helping clean tables after the event when I overheard 2 women speaking near the kitchen entrance. They did not realize I was close enough to hear. "I just hope she gets the help she needs," one woman whispered. The other nodded sympathetically. "It's sad. Nobody saw it coming." My stomach tightened. "What didn't they see coming?" the first woman asked. "The stress, the breakdown, everything with her family." I stood frozen. They were talking about me. A moment later, they noticed my presence and immediately became uncomfortable. One of them forced a smile. The other looked embarrassed. Neither woman said another word. They quickly left the room. I remained standing there, staring at the empty doorway. Breakdown, stress, family problems. The language sounded familiar because I had heard versions of it my entire life. Whenever someone threatened the Whitaker family's image, the problem somehow became that person's emotional state. Truth was inconvenient. Instability was easier to explain. As the afternoon continued, more pieces fell into place. A church elder asked if I was taking care of myself. A volunteer recommended a counseling program. Another person casually mentioned that difficult seasons could affect judgment. Nobody made direct accusations. They didn't need to. The rumor was already doing its work. By the time I drove home, anger had replaced confusion. Someone was talking. Someone was carefully shaping a story. And whoever started it understood exactly how church communities operated. They weren't trying to convince people I was lying. They were trying to convince people I couldn't be trusted. That evening, I attended a charity fundraiser Trey had been looking forward to all week. Canceling would only raise more questions, so I forced myself to go. The event was crowded. Families filled the hall. Local business owners mingled with church leaders. Children ran between tables carrying raffle tickets. Everything appeared normal until I noticed the looks. They were everywhere now. Curious looks, sympathetic looks, concerned looks. People watched me the way they might watch someone recovering from a public scandal. Then I saw Dominique across the room. She stood beside several donors, smiling as cameras flashed around her. She looked composed, confident, untouched by any of the problems threatening to consume her. For a moment, our eyes met. Neither of us looked away. Then something happened. One of the donors leaned toward her and whispered something. Dominique glanced at me again. A small smile touched her lips. Not a friendly smile, not a sister's smile, a victorious one. The message was unmistakable. She knew exactly what was happening. She wanted me to know she knew. The realization settled over me like cold rain. This wasn't random gossip. It wasn't concern spreading naturally through the community. It was deliberate. Someone had planted a narrative and allowed it to grow. Someone wanted people questioning my credibility before I ever spoke publicly about the trust fund. I looked around the room one more time and saw the results. People who had known me for years now hesitated when speaking to me. People who once trusted me now seemed uncertain. Dominique wasn't trying to defend herself. She wasn't trying to save her reputation. She was trying to destroy mine before I had the chance to threaten hers. The rumors continued spreading over the next several days, and what made them dangerous was how reasonable they sounded. Nobody claimed I was dishonest. Nobody accused me of inventing stories. Instead, people questioned my judgment. They wondered whether stress was affecting my decisions. They suggested I might be overwhelmed by family conflict. The campaign was subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation while still accomplishing its objective. By the end of the week, I realized something even more disturbing. The rumors were no longer affecting only me. They were beginning to reach Trey. It happened on a Thursday afternoon when I picked him up from school. Usually he climbed into the car talking nonstop about basketball, homework, or whatever new obsession had captured his attention. That day he seemed unusually quiet. We drove for almost 5 minutes before he finally spoke. "Mom? Yeah?" He stared out the window. "Are you sick?" My hands tightened around the steering wheel. "Why would you ask that?" He hesitated. "A kid at school said his parents heard you were having problems." I felt my stomach drop. "What kind of problems?" "I don't know." He shrugged. He said grown-ups were talking about you. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The rumors had escaped the church community. They had reached children. They had reached my son. That crossed a line I wasn't willing to ignore. I pulled into a parking lot and turned toward him. "Listen to me carefully," I said. "Whatever people are saying, you don't need to worry about it." "But are you okay?" he asked. The concern in his voice hurt more than the rumors themselves. "I'm okay," I replied softly. "And none of this is your fault." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't fully convinced. Children notice far more than adults realize. That evening, after Trey went upstairs, I sat alone in the kitchen replaying the conversation. Up until that moment, I had treated the rumors as a defensive move, something designed to protect Dominique and discourage questions. Now it felt different, personal. Whoever started this campaign understood exactly where to apply pressure. They weren't attacking me directly because they knew I could handle it. They were attacking the people around me. They were isolating me, making others question me, making me appear unstable before I ever publicly challenged them. The strategy was calculated, which meant it was probably working exactly as intended. The next confirmation came 2 days later. I attended a church volunteer planning meeting that I had participated in for nearly 4 years. Normally, my opinions carried weight. People listened. They asked questions. They respected my recommendations. This time, every suggestion I made seemed to disappear into the room without impact. Another volunteer would repeat the same idea 10 minutes later and suddenly everyone supported it. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Then I noticed the looks, not hostile, careful. The same look people give someone they believe might become emotional at any moment. By the end of the meeting, I understood. The rumors had already altered the way people perceived me. Facts no longer mattered as much as perception. Once that realization settled in, other moments started making sense. The sympathetic smiles, the cautious conversations, the uncomfortable silences. Someone had successfully changed the narrative. I drove home feeling more isolated than I had in years. Yet beneath the frustration, something else was growing. Clarity. The people responsible for the trust fund theft were making mistakes. Every day they seemed more desperate to control the story. Every day they pushed harder, and desperate people eventually overplay their hand. That night, as I reviewed my notes, I began organizing everything into categories. Financial pressure, family pressure, community pressure. One column quickly became longer than the others. Community pressure. The rumors weren't spreading randomly. Certain people repeated the same phrases, the same concerns, the same carefully chosen language. Somebody was feeding them talking points. Somebody was guiding the conversation. I didn't know who yet, but I knew it wasn't happening naturally. Then my phone buzzed beside me. A text message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. I almost ignored it. Instead, I opened it. The message contained only one sentence: "Be careful who you trust. They are saying much worse things when you're not in the room." I stared at the screen for several seconds. There was no name, no explanation, no second message, just that warning. For the first time since the rumors began, I realized something important. Not everyone believed them, and somewhere inside the church community, someone knew exactly what was happening. The anonymous text stayed on my mind for the next 2 days. Not because it provided evidence. It didn't. Not because it identified anyone involved. It didn't do that either. What mattered was something much simpler. Someone inside the church had finally acknowledged that the rumors were intentional. Until then, I had been relying on instinct and observation. Now I knew another person had seen enough to become uncomfortable. The problem was figuring out whether that person could be trusted. On Sunday morning, I arrived at church earlier than usual. If someone wanted to warn me, there was a chance they might reach out again. Instead, everything appeared normal. Families filled the lobby. Volunteers greeted visitors. My father shook hands near the sanctuary entrance while my mother floated through the crowd with her usual polished smile. Looking at them, nobody would have guessed they were hiding anything. They looked exactly the way they always looked: respected, admired, untouchable. During the service, I found myself paying less attention to the sermon and more attention to the people around me. The rumors were still there. I could feel them. Yet something else had changed. A few church members who had been distant suddenly seemed uncertain, almost guilty. One woman approached me after the service and started a conversation before abruptly changing her mind and walking away. Another looked like he wanted to say something but never did. It wasn't much, but it suggested cracks were beginning to form. Not everyone was comfortable with what was happening. After the service ended, I headed toward the parking lot. Halfway there, someone called my name. I turned and saw Mr. Roland Mercer, one of the church's longest-serving financial trustees. He was a quiet man in his 60s, who rarely involved himself in church politics. Over the years, I had always respected him because he seemed more interested in facts than appearances. "Nia," he said carefully, "do you have a minute?" We stepped away from the crowd. He glanced around before speaking again. "I don't want to get involved in family matters." That sentence immediately put me on alert. "Then why are we talking?" He sighed heavily. "Because things are starting to feel wrong." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then, he lowered his voice. "A lot of conversations have been happening recently." "About me?" He hesitated. "Among other things." That wasn't an answer. It was a confirmation. "What kind of conversations?" I asked. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, the kind that make people nervous. Before I could press further, someone exited the church and walked toward us. Mr. Mercer immediately stepped back. The conversation was over. "Just be careful," he said quietly. "And don't assume everyone knows the full story." Then he walked away. The exchange lasted less than 2 minutes, yet it changed everything. For the second time in a week, someone connected to the church had warned me without directly explaining why. Whatever was happening behind the scenes, it was creating tension even among people who normally stayed neutral. That afternoon, another piece of information arrived unexpectedly. While reviewing public records related to Dominique's company, I noticed a recent filing connected to one of her business accounts. The filing itself wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was the timing. The account had received a significant payment only days after Trey's trust fund disappeared. Not enough to prove anything. Not enough to establish a direct connection, but enough to reinforce the pattern I was already seeing. Money moved. Pressure eased. Then the rumors began. Cause and effect. The sequence was becoming harder to ignore. That evening, my mother called again. This time she skipped the small talk entirely. "People are worried about you," she said. People should worry about Dominique. Silence filled the line. You need to stop this. Stop what? The questions. Her answer came too quickly. I smiled despite myself. Interesting. I didn't mention any questions. Another silence followed. Longer this time. You're making things harder than they need to be. For who? She didn't answer. Instead, she ended the call. I stared at the phone after the screen went dark. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it revealed something important. My mother wasn't angry. She was anxious. Every attempt to pressure me, isolate me, or discredit me carried the same underlying message. They wanted me to stop looking, which meant I was looking in the right direction. Later that night, I sat alone in my office, reviewing everything again. The trust fund theft, Dominique's debts, the family meeting, the rumors, the warnings. One detail suddenly stood out. Every person trying to discourage me shared one thing in common. Not one of them had ever denied the money was missing. Not one of them had called the accusation false. They simply wanted the subject to disappear. The realization settled heavily over me. Innocent people usually argue facts. Guilty people argue consequences. As midnight approached, I closed my notebook and prepared to head upstairs. Then my phone buzzed once more. Another message from an unknown number. This one was even shorter than the first. Check the church donations from 6 months ago. Before I could respond, the number disappeared from the conversation history. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Someone wasn't just warning me anymore. Someone was pointing me towards something specific. The message stayed on my screen long after midnight. Check the church donations from 6 months ago. That was all it said. No explanation, no context, no indication of who sent it. Yet, unlike the previous warnings, this one pointed towards something specific. For the first time since the trust fund disappeared, someone wasn't simply telling me to be careful. Someone was directing me toward information. The question was why. I considered ignoring it. Anonymous tips are dangerous because they can lead exactly where someone wants you to go. But the more I thought about it, the more the timing bothered me. 6 months ago was roughly the same period when Dominique's financial troubles appeared to accelerate. It was also around the time my parents became unusually defensive whenever church finances were mentioned. By the following morning, curiosity had won. I began reviewing publicly available church reports, donor newsletters, fundraising announcements, and community outreach summaries. Most of the information was routine: building projects, charity drives, scholarship programs, nothing unusual. Then I noticed something strange. A major fundraising campaign announced 6 months earlier had generated significantly more money than expected. According to church publications, the campaign was celebrated as one of the most successful in recent years. Yet several projects supposedly funded by those donations appeared delayed or incomplete. At first, I assumed it was poor planning. Large organizations miss deadlines all the time. But the discrepancy kept bothering me. If the fundraising campaign was truly as successful as reported, where had all the money gone? I spent the next several hours cross-referencing reports and public statements. The deeper I looked, the more inconsistencies appeared. Small inconsistencies, individually harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. Certain expenses were described vaguely. Some budget updates never received follow-up reports. Several announcements celebrated future projects that seemed to vanish entirely a few months later. None of it proved wrongdoing, but it raised questions, and lately people seemed very interested in preventing questions. That afternoon, I attended a community luncheon hosted by one of the church's partner organizations. My father was scheduled to speak. Normally, I would have skipped the event. This time, I wanted to observe. During the reception, I noticed something unusual. Several major donors appeared tense whenever church expansion projects were discussed. Not angry, concerned. One conversation in particular caught my attention. 2 longtime contributors were speaking near the refreshment table. "I still haven't seen the final report," one man said quietly. The other shook his head. "Neither have I. Jerome keeps saying it's coming. He's been saying that for months." The conversation ended when they noticed people approaching. Yet it added another piece to the growing puzzle. Questions existed, not just mine. Other people were asking questions too. Whether they realized it or not, they were pulling on the same thread. Later that evening, I reviewed everything I had gathered. The trust fund theft remained the center of the story, but now another possibility had emerged. What if Dominique's financial crisis wasn't the only problem being hidden? What if multiple problems were colliding at the same time? Suddenly, the pressure campaign against me made more sense. The desperation, the rumors, the family meeting, the attempts to silence me. People don't react that aggressively to a single uncomfortable question. They react that way when several dangerous questions threaten to surface at once. The realization unsettled me. Up until now, I had viewed the situation primarily as a family betrayal. My parents protecting Dominique, Andre helping them, a stolen trust fund, horrible but contained. Now I wasn't so sure. If church finances were also under scrutiny, the stakes could be much larger than I originally believed. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I answered after the third ring. "Nia," he said, his voice unusually controlled. "We need to talk." "About what?" "You know exactly what." His answer immediately raised my guard. "Actually, I don't." Silence filled the line. Then he spoke again. "People are starting to ask unnecessary questions." There it was. Questions. Not accusations. Not lies. Questions. "Questions usually have answers," I replied. "Not all questions are helpful." I almost laughed. That sentence perfectly summarized my father's worldview. Questions were welcome when they benefited him. Dangerous when they didn't. "What exactly are you worried about?" I asked. Another pause followed. Longer this time. "I'm worried you're creating problems where none exist." The irony was almost unbelievable. My son had lost $250,000, and somehow I was the one creating problems. The conversation ended shortly afterward, but one thing stayed with me. My father sounded different. Not angry. Not confident. Cautious. For the first time since this began, he sounded like a man who wasn't entirely sure he could control the outcome. Near midnight, I returned to my office and stared at the notes covering my desk. The trust fund, Dominique's debts, the rumors, the church donations, the nervous donors, the incomplete reports. None of the pieces fit together perfectly yet. But they were getting closer. Then I noticed something I had overlooked earlier. One of the largest fundraising campaigns had ended only 3 weeks before Dominique received the financial relief that seemed to stabilize her business. I stared at the dates for several seconds. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, for the first time, I found myself wondering whether Dominique's problems and the church's problems had become connected long before Trey's trust fund ever disappeared. For the next several days, I forced myself to stop chasing conclusions and focus on patterns instead. Every time I thought I was close to understanding the full picture, another detail appeared that complicated everything. The trust fund theft still sat at the center of the story, but by now it felt less like the crime itself and more like the symptom of a much larger problem. Too many people were nervous. Too many conversations ended abruptly. Too many individuals who normally carried themselves with confidence suddenly seemed desperate to control what questions were being asked. The donor recognition banquet became impossible to ignore. The more I reviewed the guest list, the stranger it looked. My parents would be there. Several church board members would be there. Major donors would be there. Community business leaders would be there. Even a number of investors connected to Dominique's company had confirmed attendance. It looked less like a celebration and more like a gathering of everyone who had a stake in maintaining the same public story. 3 days before the banquet, I attended a community luncheon where I unexpectedly ran into Leonard Brooks again. This time he approached me first. We exchanged polite conversation for a few minutes before he lowered his voice. "You still asking questions?" he asked. "Depends on the question," I replied. He looked around carefully before speaking again. Sometimes people become so focused on protecting a reputation that they stop noticing how many compromises they've made. The statement sounded oddly specific. "Are we talking about Dominique?" I asked. He hesitated. "I'm talking about a lot of people." Before I could press further, someone called his name from across the room. He gave me a look I couldn't quite interpret and walked away. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it reinforced something I had been feeling for weeks. Dominique wasn't carrying this burden alone. Whatever trouble she was in, other people had become invested in the outcome. Later that evening, I sat in my office reviewing timelines again. I added new dates, new names, new connections. Eventually, my attention returned to the fundraising campaign from 6 months earlier. The campaign itself wasn't suspicious. The timing was. Certain financial pressures seemed to increase shortly afterward. Certain conversations became more urgent. Certain promises appeared to remain unresolved. None of it proved wrongdoing, but it suggested a growing sense of pressure behind the scenes. Pressure creates mistakes. Pressure creates desperation. And desperation often leads otherwise careful people to take risks. The next morning, another unexpected development arrived. One of the church's longtime donors publicly withdrew support from a future project. The announcement wasn't dramatic, but it generated noticeable concern among church leadership. My father spent most of that afternoon making phone calls. My mother canceled 2 social engagements. Even Dominique appeared distracted during a promotional event she posted online. Watching their reactions, I realized something important. They weren't behaving like people who had solved a problem. They were behaving like people constantly trying to prevent the next one. The pressure wasn't disappearing, it was growing. 2 days later, while reviewing public business filings connected to Dominique's company, I noticed something that immediately caught my attention. One of the investors attending the upcoming banquet had recently increased financial involvement with her business despite poor performance indicators. From a business perspective, the decision made very little sense. Investors usually move toward stability. This investor moved toward risk. I spent the rest of the evening trying to understand why. The answer never came, but the question itself mattered, because once again, someone appeared willing to commit resources to keeping Dominique afloat. The pattern repeated itself over and over. Debt appeared. Assistance followed. Problems emerged. Support arrived. Consequences approached. Someone intervened. By now, it was impossible to believe she was surviving on her own. The real mystery was identifying who stood to lose the most if she failed. The night before the banquet, I found myself staring at the guest list one final time. Names that once seemed unrelated now appeared connected by a common goal. Maintaining confidence, protecting appearances, avoiding scrutiny. Whether they realized it or not, they were all moving in the same direction. Then my phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. Another anonymous message. This one contained only 7 words. Watch who leaves the banquet together. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. No explanation followed. No additional information arrived. Just that simple instruction. As I set the phone down, a feeling settled over me that I couldn't shake. For weeks I had been looking for evidence hidden inside documents, conversations, and financial records. But maybe the next breakthrough wasn't waiting in paperwork. Maybe it was waiting in people. And if the anonymous sender was right, the banquet was about to reveal far more than anyone intended. The donor recognition banquet arrived on a Friday evening, and from the moment I stepped into the ballroom, I understood why so many people seemed invested in making the event a success. Nearly everyone connected to the church's public image was there. Donors, business leaders, community officials, investors, board members, and local media representatives filled the room. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, cameras flashed near the entrance. Smiles appeared everywhere. On the surface, it looked like a celebration. Underneath, it felt like a performance. My father moved confidently between tables, greeting guests and shaking hands. My mother looked completely at ease, charming donors and posing for photographs. Dominique wore a designer gown and carried herself like someone determined to convince the world she was winning. If her business was struggling, nobody would have guessed it from her appearance. The entire evening seemed designed to project stability. That alone made me pay closer attention. The anonymous message from the previous night kept repeating in my mind. Watch who leaves the banquet together. It wasn't much to work with, but it was more specific than any previous warning. So instead of focusing on speeches or presentations, I focused on people. I watched who spoke with whom. I watched who avoided certain conversations. I watched who seemed nervous whenever financial topics appeared. As the evening progressed, several familiar patterns emerged. Dominique spent an unusual amount of time moving between investors and church leadership. My mother repeatedly checked on her throughout the night. My father held several private conversations that ended the moment another guest approached. Nothing was dramatic. Nothing was obvious. Yet together, the behavior created the same impression I had experienced for weeks. Everyone seemed worried about maintaining something. Near the middle of the event, I noticed Andre standing near one of the side entrances, speaking with a businessman I recognized from the guest list. Their conversation appeared serious. A few minutes later, Dominique joined them. The three spoke briefly before separating again. Another small detail. Another piece of a puzzle that still refused to reveal its full shape. The formal presentations began shortly afterward. My father delivered a speech celebrating community growth and future opportunities. Donors received recognition. Projects were highlighted. Success stories filled the room. Every few minutes, applause erupted from one side of the ballroom or another. Yet, despite all the optimism, I kept noticing signs of strain. Certain smiles looked forced. Certain conversations ended abruptly. Certain people appeared distracted. The atmosphere reminded me of a company trying to reassure investors before announcing disappointing results. Everything looked polished. Nothing felt comfortable. As the evening moved toward its conclusion, guests slowly began leaving. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I positioned myself near the exit without drawing attention and watched carefully. Most departures meant nothing. Couples left together. Friends shared rides. Donors exchanged farewells. Then something unusual happened. One of the investors connected to Dominique's company quietly exited through a side corridor instead of the main entrance. A few minutes later, another familiar face followed. Then another. None of them left together. None of them interacted publicly. Yet each chose the same route. My curiosity immediately sharpened. 5 minutes later, Andre disappeared in the same direction. My pulse quickened. Shortly afterward, Dominique excused herself from a conversation and followed as well. I waited several seconds before moving. The corridor led away from the ballroom toward a private section of the hotel. By the time I reached the area, the group had already entered a conference room near the end of the hallway. The door closed before I could get close enough to hear anything. I remained where I was, pretending to check messages on my phone while watching the entrance from a distance. More than 20 minutes passed. Nobody emerged. Whatever was happening inside, it clearly wasn't a casual conversation. Eventually, I returned to the main ballroom before anyone noticed my absence. The event ended shortly afterward. Guests departed. Staff began cleaning tables. The celebration was officially over. Yet I left with the strange feeling that the real meeting had happened somewhere else entirely. On the drive home, I replayed the sequence repeatedly. Investors, Andre, Dominique, private conference room, no public explanation, no visible reason for the gathering. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe not. But after everything I had already uncovered, coincidence was becoming increasingly difficult to believe. When I finally arrived home, I checked my phone one last time before going inside. A new message had arrived from the same unknown source. This one contained only a single sentence. The people in that room are more afraid than you realize. The message stayed with me throughout the weekend. The people in that room are more afraid than you realize. At first, I assumed it was another attempt to push me toward a conclusion without providing evidence. But the more I thought about what I had seen at the banquet, the more the statement made sense. Fear explained almost everything. It explained the rumors. It explained the pressure campaign. It explained the family meeting, the strange conversations, the nervous donors, and the growing effort to control information. Confident people don't spend months managing questions. Frightened people do. The following Monday, I returned to my office and reviewed everything from the beginning. Trey's trust fund, Dominique's debt problems, the church fundraising campaign, the anonymous warnings, the banquet. For the first time, I stopped looking at each event separately and focused on the people involved instead. A pattern emerged immediately. The same names kept appearing. My parents, Dominique, Andre, certain board members, several investors, different situations, different timelines, the same individuals. Whatever connected them, it was strong enough to keep them moving together even as pressure increased. Later that afternoon, I received another unexpected clue. One of the investors who attended the private conference room meeting abruptly withdrew from a public development project connected to the church. The decision surprised several community leaders because the investor had supported the project for months. Publicly, the explanation sounded reasonable. Privately, the timing felt strange. Another person quietly stepping away from something. Another sign of instability beneath the surface. By now, I had learned to pay attention whenever behavior changed unexpectedly. That evening, Andre came home later than usual. During dinner, he barely touched his food. Trey talked about school while Andre nodded distractedly. Twice, I caught him staring at his phone. 3 times, he left the table to answer messages. The difference was subtle, but it was there. For weeks, I had watched him pretend everything was under control. Now small cracks were beginning to appear. Not panic, not yet, just strain. After Trey went upstairs, Andre stepped onto the back patio with his phone. Through the kitchen window, I watched him pace slowly while speaking to someone. I couldn't hear the conversation. I didn't need to. His body language told its own story. Frustration, concern, pressure. When he finally returned inside, he looked exhausted. "Long day?" I asked. "Something like that," he replied. Normally, he would have offered an explanation. This time, he didn't. The next morning, another unusual event occurred. My father canceled a community appearance with almost no notice. That had happened only a handful of times during his entire ministry. People immediately began speculating. Health concerns, scheduling conflicts, family obligations. Nobody seemed certain. What caught my attention was my mother's reaction. Instead of dismissing the rumors, she avoided discussing them entirely. The behavior felt familiar. It was the same strategy I had seen repeated for weeks. Deflect, redirect, avoid specifics. The more I observed, the more I became convinced that multiple problems were colliding behind the scenes. Not one crisis, several. And each new complication seemed to make everyone more nervous. 2 days later, I attended a small business networking event downtown. I almost skipped it until I noticed one of Dominique's investors listed among the attendees. The man spent most of the evening avoiding conversations about her company. That alone was interesting. Near the end of the event, I overheard him speaking quietly with another businessman. "We just need a few more weeks," he said. The other man shook his head. "You've been saying that for months. The situation is stabilizing." "Is it?" Silence followed. Then the conversation ended. Once again, there were no answers, only pressure, deadlines, delays, people buying time. Everyone seemed focused on surviving the next few weeks. Nobody appeared focused on the future. Driving home that night, I finally accepted something I had been resisting. Whatever secret connected these people, it was reaching a breaking point. The trust fund theft wasn't the cause of their fear. It was a consequence of it. They were already in trouble before they touched my son's money. The theft simply bought them more time. Time for what? I still didn't know. But every new conversation pointed toward the same conclusion. Something important was approaching. Something they desperately wanted to avoid. When I arrived home, I found another anonymous message waiting on my phone. By now, I no longer questioned whether the sender had inside knowledge. The information was too specific, too consistent. This message contained only 6 words. "They're preparing for the next move." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I looked at the growing collection of notes covering my desk. For weeks, I had been reacting to events after they happened. Rumors, meetings, financial pressure, secret conversations. Maybe that was about to change. Because if the anonymous sender was right, the people protecting Dominique were no longer trying to contain the damage. They were preparing for something else entirely. The anonymous message bothered me more than the others. They're preparing for the next move. Unlike previous warnings, this one implied action rather than concealment. For weeks, everyone around Dominique had focused on damage control, rumors, pressure, deflection, delays. If they were preparing for a next move, it meant simply buying time was no longer enough. Someone had decided they needed a new strategy. The question was whether that strategy involved protecting themselves or eliminating whatever threat they believed I represented. Over the next several days, I paid closer attention than ever. Small details began standing out everywhere. My father spent less time making public appearances and more time in private meetings. My mother became unusually difficult to reach. Even Dominique's social media presence changed. Instead of promoting future growth, she focused heavily on messages about resilience, loyalty, and overcoming adversity. To most people, the posts probably seemed harmless. To me, they felt calculated, almost as if she were preparing a public narrative before something happened. Andre changed as well. The confidence that had protected him for weeks was fading. He still pretended everything was normal, but the performance required more effort. He slept less. He checked his phone constantly. Twice, I caught him staring into space during conversations as though he were mentally rehearsing something. The pressure was finally reaching him. One evening, I returned home earlier than expected after a meeting cancellation. As I entered the house, I heard voices coming from Andre's office. Instinct immediately told me to stop. The door was partially closed. I couldn't hear every word, but I recognized Dominique's voice almost instantly. "We can't keep waiting," she said. Andre responded too quietly for me to understand. "They're already asking questions," Dominique continued. "More people than before." A long pause followed. Then Andre spoke. "Panicking won't help. Neither will pretending everything is fine." I moved slightly closer. My pulse was racing. For weeks I had watched them communicate in fragments and half conversations. This was the most direct exchange I had overheard. "We need one plan," Dominique said. "Not 5 different plans." Silence followed again. Then footsteps approached the door. I immediately retreated down the hallway and entered the kitchen before either of them emerged. Moments later, Dominique walked past without noticing me. Her expression looked nothing like the confident public image she worked so hard to maintain. She looked exhausted, frightened, cornered. Watching her leave should have felt satisfying. Instead, it confirmed something I already suspected. Whatever crisis had started, this chain of events was getting worse. 2 days later, another piece of information surfaced unexpectedly. A church board member resigned. Publicly, the departure was described as personal. Privately, nobody seemed willing to discuss it. The timing attracted immediate attention because the individual had served for nearly a decade without controversy. People don't usually walk away from positions like that unless something changes. Once again, I found myself asking the same question: what exactly was everyone so afraid of? The answer remained frustratingly out of reach, yet the behavior around me continued shifting. More meetings, more private conversations, more signs of tension. One afternoon, I noticed something that finally pushed my suspicions even further. While reviewing public event schedules, I discovered that several key people connected to Dominique's business and the church had arranged separate meetings on the same day the following week. The meetings appeared unrelated on paper, different locations, different purposes, different participants, yet the overlap was impossible to ignore. It looked coordinated, not openly, carefully, like people trying very hard not to appear connected. That evening, I sat alone in my office staring at the growing web of names and dates I had assembled over the previous weeks. The trust fund theft was no longer the only mystery. It had become the doorway into something larger. Every time I focused on Dominique, I found connections leading elsewhere. Every time I examined church finances, I found links leading back to the same group of people. The circle kept tightening. Then my phone vibrated. Another anonymous message. By now, I opened it immediately. This one was longer than usual. Not much longer, just enough to change everything. Stop looking at what they're hiding. Start looking at what they're trying to protect. I read the sentence 3 times. Then I slowly set the phone down. For weeks, I had assumed the missing money, the rumors, and the secret meetings were the center of the story. Maybe they weren't. Maybe they were defenses surrounding something far more important. Something valuable enough to justify lies, theft, and public manipulation. Something powerful enough to keep all of them working together despite growing pressure. As midnight approached, I found myself staring at the names on my wall one final time. For the first time since this began, I felt as though I was standing directly in front of the answer. I just couldn't see it clearly yet, but whatever they were protecting, I was closer to it than ever before. And deep down, I had a feeling they knew it too. The anonymous message changed the way I looked at everything. Stop looking at what they're hiding. Start looking at what they're trying to protect. For days, those words followed me everywhere. At first, I treated them like another clue. Then, I realized they were something else entirely. A correction. Whoever was sending the messages believed I was asking the wrong question. The missing trust fund mattered. Dominique's debts mattered. The rumors mattered. But maybe none of those things were the real objective. Maybe they were only symptoms of a larger threat. Once I accepted that possibility, the entire situation began to look different. Instead of focusing on individual events, I focused on outcomes. Every decision my family made seemed designed to achieve the same goal: preserve confidence, maintain appearances, prevent scrutiny. Whether the issue involved Dominique's company, church leadership, donors, or public reputation, the response never changed. Protect the image. Protect the image at all costs. The realization bothered me because it suggested something far more fragile existed beneath the surface. Strong institutions welcome questions. Fragile institutions fear them. A few days later, another unexpected development pushed that theory even further. One of the investors connected to Dominique's business quietly withdrew from a planned expansion project. Publicly, the decision was described as a routine business adjustment. Privately, the reaction was immediate. My father scheduled emergency meetings. Several board members canceled public appearances. Dominique disappeared from social events for nearly 2 days. Nobody panics when everything is stable. People panic when stability depends on confidence. The timing felt impossible to ignore. That same week, I attended a community fundraiser hosted by one of the church's partner organizations. The atmosphere was noticeably different from previous events. Conversations felt cautious. Smiles looked forced. Several donors appeared distracted. Even people with no direct connection to my family seemed aware that something wasn't right. Near the end of the evening, I found myself speaking with a businessman who had contributed to church projects for years. We weren't close, but we knew each other well enough to exchange polite conversation. At one point, he lowered his voice and asked a simple question: "Have things settled down yet?" I immediately knew he wasn't talking about church activities. "What makes you think anything happened?" I asked. He gave a small smile. "People talk." The answer told me everything. The rumors, the tension, the uncertainty. None of it remained confined to church leadership anymore. It was spreading. Not dramatically, not publicly, but enough that people outside the immediate circle had begun noticing. Whatever my parents were trying to contain was becoming harder to control. Later that night, I reviewed the names connected to the situation once again. Investors, board members, donors, family members. The same pattern appeared every time. Different people. Shared interests. Shared risks. Shared reasons to avoid unwanted attention. Then I noticed something I should have seen earlier. Several key individuals connected to Dominique's company also maintained unusually close relationships with church projects. Not illegal, not suspicious by itself, just interconnected. More interconnected than I originally realized. The same names appeared repeatedly across different organizations. Business relationships overlapped with charitable partnerships. Community initiatives overlapped with fundraising efforts. The network wasn't hidden. It simply hadn't seemed important until now. Suddenly, it felt very important. Because interconnected systems share vulnerabilities. When pressure hits one area, it spreads. Maybe that was why everyone looked so frightened. Not because a single problem existed, because multiple problems were connected. The following afternoon, Andre came home earlier than usual. For nearly an hour, he sat alone in the living room staring at nothing. He didn't turn on the television. He didn't check his phone. He simply sat there thinking. I had never seen him like that before. Eventually, he noticed me watching. "Long day?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "Something like that." Then he stood and walked away. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it confirmed what I had already suspected. Whatever pressure existed behind the scenes was reaching him too. The people protecting the secret were no longer operating from a position of confidence. They were reacting, adjusting, trying to stay ahead of something they could feel approaching. That evening, as I prepared to shut down my office for the night, another anonymous message arrived. My pulse immediately quickened. The messages had become increasingly specific, increasingly urgent. I opened it without hesitation. This one contained only a single sentence: "They're meeting again tomorrow. This time, someone is going to break." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I looked at the wall covered with names, dates, notes, and connections. For weeks, every person involved had maintained the same united front. My parents, Dominique, Andre, church leadership, investors, donors. Nobody had cracked. Nobody had stepped out of line. Nobody had publicly challenged the story. But pressure changes people. Fear changes people. And eventually, someone always decides protecting themselves is more important than protecting everyone else. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that the balance was finally shifting. The people controlling the narrative had spent weeks trying to silence questions. Now they seemed increasingly worried about each other. And if the anonymous sender was right, the next meeting wasn't going to strengthen their alliance, it was going to test it. The message arrived shortly before midnight, but it was all I could think about the next morning. They're meeting again tomorrow. This time, someone is going to break. For weeks, the anonymous sender had never exaggerated. Every warning eventually proved meaningful. That was why I couldn't ignore this one. Somewhere behind the carefully managed public image, pressure was building. The question wasn't whether cracks existed anymore. The question was who would crack first. Throughout the following day, I paid closer attention to everyone connected to the situation. The changes were subtle, but they were there. My father looked more tired than usual during a community appearance. My mother seemed distracted during conversations she would normally control effortlessly. Even Dominique's confidence appeared strained. She smiled when cameras were present, but the moment attention shifted elsewhere, the smile disappeared. It reminded me of someone trying to hold together a collapsing wall with bare hands. By late afternoon, I learned that several church leaders had gathered for a private meeting at one of the organization's administrative buildings. Officially, the meeting concerned future community initiatives. Unofficially, nobody seemed willing to discuss it. The secrecy alone made it interesting. The timing made it impossible to ignore. That evening, I found myself sitting in my office reviewing notes again, not because I expected to discover something new, because I wanted to understand what was happening emotionally inside the group I had been tracking for weeks. Fear had become the common denominator. Not guilt, not greed. Fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of failure. Fear of consequences. Whatever connected these people, it had reached a point where maintaining control required constant effort. And constant effort eventually wears people down. The following morning, signs of that exhaustion finally appeared. Around noon, I received a call from a church volunteer I barely knew. The conversation began normally enough. Community events, scheduling issues, routine matters. Then, almost by accident, she mentioned hearing raised voices after the private meeting ended. People sounded upset, she said. More upset than I've ever heard them. Before I could ask additional questions, she quickly changed the subject. But the damage was done. For the first time, someone outside the inner circle had witnessed tension directly. The united front was weakening. Later that day, another unusual event occurred. One of the investors frequently connected to Dominique canceled attendance at a public function less than an hour before it began. The cancellation attracted attention because he rarely missed important appearances. Even more interesting was Dominique's reaction. During the event, she repeatedly checked her phone and seemed unable to focus on conversations. At one point, she left the room entirely for nearly 20 minutes. When she returned, her expression looked noticeably worse. Whatever message she received, she clearly didn't like it. Watching from a distance, I felt something shift inside me. For weeks, I had been chasing evidence. Now I was watching pressure produce results on its own. People were beginning to unravel. That night, Andre came home later than anyone expected. He looked exhausted. Not physically, mentally. Like someone carrying too many problems at once. During dinner, Trey asked a simple question about an upcoming school event. Normally, Andre would have answered immediately. Instead, he seemed distracted and needed several seconds to respond. It was a small moment, but it revealed how much his focus had deteriorated. The strain was affecting everyone. After Trey went upstairs, Andre spent nearly an hour alone on the patio. I watched him through the kitchen window. Twice he made phone calls. Twice he appeared frustrated. The conversations were too far away to hear clearly, but his body language told its own story. Whatever alliance had protected Dominique for months was no longer operating smoothly. Too many people wanted too many different things. The next morning brought the clearest sign yet. A longtime church supporter publicly questioned delays involving one of the fundraising initiatives from 6 months earlier. The criticism was polite, respectful, reasonable. Yet the response from church leadership felt unusually defensive. Several explanations appeared almost immediately. Statements were issued. Reassurances were offered. The reaction seemed disproportionate compared to the question itself. And that was exactly what caught my attention. Innocent questions shouldn't trigger urgent damage control. By evening, I felt more certain than ever that the situation was approaching a turning point. Then my phone vibrated. Another anonymous message. My pulse quickened immediately. The messages had become increasingly direct over the past few weeks. This one was no different. Tomorrow changes everything. Someone has decided to protect themselves. I stared at the words for a long time. Then I slowly set the phone down and looked at the names covering my wall. For months, everyone involved had behaved as though their survival depended on loyalty. Now that loyalty appeared to be cracking. Fear had finally become stronger than trust. And when that happens, secrets don't stay buried for very long. The message haunted me all night. Tomorrow changes everything. Someone has decided to protect themselves. By sunrise, I was already awake, sitting in my office surrounded by weeks of notes, timelines, names, and connections. For months, everyone involved had acted as though their survival depended on unity. Investors protected donors. Donors protected church leadership. Church leadership protected Dominique. My family protected everyone. That arrangement only worked if every person remained loyal. The anonymous sender believed that loyalty had finally broken. As the morning progressed, tension seemed to spread everywhere. My father canceled another public appearance. My mother declined multiple calls from community leaders. Dominique posted nothing online for the first time in weeks. Even Andre appeared distracted before leaving for work. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, but everyone seemed aware that something had changed. Around noon, the first sign appeared. A respected member of the church finance committee abruptly requested a review meeting concerning several delayed projects connected to the fundraising campaign from 6 months earlier. Under normal circumstances, the request would have attracted little attention. This time, the reaction was immediate. Phone calls began. Meetings were scheduled. Several board members suddenly became unavailable. Watching the response unfold, I felt the same sensation I had experienced since this nightmare began. Fear. Not annoyance. Not inconvenience. Fear. People only react that strongly when they believe questions might lead somewhere dangerous. Later that afternoon, I attended a community event where many church supporters had gathered. The atmosphere felt completely different from previous weeks. Conversations were shorter. Smiles were forced. Groups formed and dissolved quickly. More importantly, people were talking less about me. For the first time, I wasn't the center of the whispers. Something else had replaced me. I couldn't hear enough to understand exactly what, but I recognized uncertainty when I saw it. The rumors that once targeted me had begun turning inward. The people spreading them were now watching each other. That shift mattered. When attention moves from the outsider to the insiders, alliances become fragile. Near the end of the event, I noticed Dominique standing alone near the back of the room. That alone was unusual. For months, she had surrounded herself with supporters, donors, and family members. Today she looked isolated. Her phone remained in her hand almost constantly. Twice she read messages and immediately looked upset. Once she left the room altogether before returning 10 minutes later. The confidence she worked so hard to project was disappearing. Watching her, I realized something important. Dominique wasn't acting like someone who feared exposure. She was acting like someone who feared abandonment. There is a difference. Exposure threatens the secret. Abandonment threatens the people protecting it. The realization followed me throughout the evening. Maybe the crisis wasn't that someone had discovered the truth. Maybe the crisis was that someone inside the group no longer wanted to carry it. Hours later, after returning home, I received another unexpected clue. One of the investors connected to Dominique's company publicly announced a pause on future financial commitments until several pending matters were clarified. The statement sounded professional, responsible, ordinary. Yet the timing was devastating. This wasn't a stranger questioning the situation. This was one of the people who had spent months helping maintain stability. Another person stepping back. Another crack in the wall. By now, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. People were distancing themselves, quietly, carefully. but unmistakably. The next morning, the pressure intensified again. Community leaders began asking questions about delayed projects. Donors wanted updates. Board members wanted meetings. Everyone suddenly seemed interested in information they had ignored for months. It was as if an invisible barrier had disappeared overnight. Once one person stepped back, others found the courage to do the same. The fear that once protected the secret was now weakening it. Late that afternoon, Andre came home earlier than expected. He walked into the house, loosened his tie, and sat heavily at the kitchen table without saying a word. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked up. His expression seemed older than it had the week before. "Things are getting complicated," he said quietly. The statement caught me off guard. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an explanation. Yet it was the most honest thing I had heard from him in months. Before I could respond, he stood and left the room. The conversation lasted only seconds, but it confirmed everything I had been sensing. Control was slipping away. That night, I returned to my office and reviewed my notes one final time. The trust fund theft, Dominique's debts, the fundraising campaign, the rumors, the private meetings, the investors, the pressure. Every path eventually led back to the same group of people. For weeks, they had managed to keep the truth hidden behind loyalty and fear. Now loyalty was fading. Fear was changing sides. Then my phone vibrated. Another anonymous message appeared. I opened it immediately. This one contained more words than usual. Not many, just enough to make my heart race. "Tomorrow morning. Someone is bringing documents. Don't look for the loudest person in the room. Watch the one who says nothing." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I slowly leaned back in my chair. For the first time since Trey carried that red velvet box through my front door, I felt certain the waiting was almost over. Whatever secret everyone had spent months protecting was finally approaching the surface. And somewhere inside tomorrow's meeting, someone was about to decide whether saving themselves mattered more than protecting everyone else. The meeting took place the following morning in one of the church's administrative conference rooms. By the time I arrived, the atmosphere already felt different. For months, everyone involved had operated with confidence, believing they could control the narrative, contain the damage, and silence anyone who asked the wrong questions. That confidence was gone. The room was filled with tension. Church board members sat quietly around the table. Several major donors were present. A few investors connected to Dominique's company occupied seats near the back. My father looked exhausted. My mother looked frightened despite her efforts to appear calm. Dominique seemed completely drained. Even Andre appeared older than he had a few weeks earlier. Then I remembered the anonymous message. "Don't look for the loudest person in the room. Watch the one who says nothing." So I stopped paying attention to my father. I stopped watching Dominique. Instead, I focused on Roland Mercer. The longtime financial trustee sat quietly near the far end of the table. He had barely spoken since I entered. He simply listened, watched, waited. 20 minutes into the meeting, the questions began. Donors wanted updates on delayed projects. Board members wanted explanations regarding missing reports. Investors wanted clarification about future commitments. For the first time, nobody seemed interested in protecting appearances. They wanted answers. My father attempted to control the discussion, but every answer created another question. The pressure continued building. Then it happened. Roland slowly opened a folder and placed several documents on the table. The room fell silent. "Before this continues," he said quietly, "everyone deserves to see these." My pulse immediately accelerated. One by one, copies were distributed around the room. Confused expressions quickly transformed into shock, then anger, then disbelief. The documents revealed months of private transfers, emergency funding arrangements, donor reallocations, and internal communications showing how desperately church leadership had been trying to prevent Dominique's business from collapsing. No, the church had not directly stolen money, but church influence, donor relationships, and private pressure had been repeatedly used to keep Dominique afloat. Every crisis led to another rescue. Every rescue created another problem. Every problem required another compromise. The cycle had continued until desperation overwhelmed judgment. Then Roland revealed the final document. The room became completely silent. It was a record showing that several people had known about concerns surrounding the trust fund transaction weeks before I discovered it. Not proof that everyone participated, proof that people looked away, proof that people chose silence. My father closed his eyes. My mother began crying. Dominique stared at the table without speaking. For months, they had insisted the situation was about family loyalty. Now everyone could finally see what it had really been about. Fear. Fear of failure. Fear of scandal. Fear of losing status. Fear of consequences. And in that fear, they had convinced themselves that protecting Dominique justified everything. Finally, one donor looked directly at my father. "Did you know?" he asked. The question seemed to echo through the room. My father remained silent for several seconds. Then, for the first time since this nightmare began, he stopped protecting the story. "Yes," he answered quietly. No excuses followed. No speeches, no justifications, just one word. "Yes." The room exploded with reactions. Questions came from every direction. Board members demanded explanations. Donors demanded accountability. Investors began distancing themselves immediately. The alliance that had spent months protecting itself collapsed in less than 10 minutes. Fear had held them together. The truth pulled them apart. Through it all, I found myself looking at Dominique. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She simply looked defeated. For years, my parents had rescued her from consequences. Every mistake had been softened. Every failure had been hidden. Every lesson had been postponed. Eventually, she stopped believing consequences applied to her at all. Until now. Then Andre spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." I turned toward him. It was the first genuine apology I had heard from anyone involved. Not because it fixed anything. Not because it erased the betrayal. Because it arrived without excuses. He admitted helping facilitate access. He admitted convincing himself it was temporary. He admitted believing the money would be replaced before anyone noticed. Every terrible decision had started with the same lie. Just this once. The meeting continued for hours, but the outcome was already clear. Investigations would follow. Positions would be lost. Relationships would end. Reputations would suffer. None of that interested me anymore. Because when the room finally emptied, only one thing mattered. Trey. That evening I picked him up from school and took him for ice cream. We sat outside watching the sunset while children played nearby. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest felt lighter. "Mom?" Trey asked. "Yeah? Is everything okay now?" I looked at my son and smiled. Not the forced smile I had worn for weeks. A real one. "Not everything," I answered honestly. "But it will be." He nodded and returned to his ice cream. Children have a way of accepting hope more easily than adults. As I watched him laugh, I thought about my grandmother and the trust she created for him. The money mattered. The betrayal mattered. The consequences mattered. But the most important thing was something my family never understood. The trust wasn't really about money. It was about protecting his future. In the end, that future survived. Not because powerful people defended it. Because someone finally refused to stay silent. And as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I realized something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Blood can make you related. Fear can make people betray you. But character is revealed by what you protect when protecting it becomes difficult. And when the moment finally came, I chose my son.